Ladies and gentlemen, if we can begin, we're ready to begin our final session. Ladies and gentlemen, we are ready to start. By the way, we are joined for this session by two additional guests of the conference. We'd like to welcome the columnist and author Joe Klein, and we'd also like to welcome from the American Film Institute and the author of Ain't Misbehavin', Murray Horowitz. And Lou Gossett has graciously allowed us to go out of order for this session, and I'd like to start with a commentator from the world of sports, Dave Zirin, the author of What's My Name, Fool? Sports and Resistance in the United States. Dave?
Thank you so much. Can people hear me all right? Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Gossett, who's actually in one of my all-time favorite anti-racist movies that I'm going to guess most people here haven't seen, a movie called Diggstown, which I loved. I absolutely loved. Thanks so much, Janet Cohen, and thanks so much to one of the great basketball players the state of Maine has produced, Bill Cohen. Honestly, that's not saying a great deal, but with all due respect to Maine. But when the Cohens asked me to come speak here, it did feel a little out of place as a sports writer. I told my wife I felt a little bit like Dick Cheney being asked to come to a solar energy convention. I'm not quite sure what I really brought to the table, but just hearing people speak about the persistence, the institutional persistence of American racism, it really reminded me of the words of one of Pittsburgh and Puerto Rico's favorite sons, Roberto Clemente, who once said upon coming to the United States and playing in the Southern minor league system that he never knew he was black in Puerto Rico, and he was only taught that he was black once he entered the United States. I want to start with just some facts, and facts are stubborn things. These are sad facts, but facts nonetheless. Here's a fact. More people watch ESPN than C-SPAN. That's a fact. Here's another fact. More people listen to sports radio than NPR. That's a fact. And another fact is more of our young people, black or white, would rather grow up to be Michael Jordan than maybe just about anybody else. Now, here's another fact as well, and that's that intellectuals, thinkers, people like the folks in this room today, tend to shun the world of sports as political space. I think we can all safely agree about that. And I'm here to argue that that's actually a mistake, particularly when it becomes to having a serious national discussion about race and racism. We should all heed the words of Professor Walters earlier today, what seems like only a few short days ago, this morning. Just kidding. But Professor Walters, what he said was that it's so important that we figure out a way to popularize these ideas, that it's not enough to have the right ideas. We have to figure out how to popularize these ideas. And I would argue that it's in sports over the last several years that we've had a more honest discussion about race and racism than almost any other cultural sphere in our country. And you just have to listen to sports radio, and it's there. People from the supposed right, left, working class, middle class, you listen to sports radio and it crackles with the questions of race and racism. When people have arguments about Barry Bonds and whether or not he should actually be on a team right now or in this permanent purgatory where he currently exists, the anabolic purgatory where Barry Bonds currently exists. When people debate on sports radio about whether or not the National Basketball Association should have a dress code, when people debate about whether or not Michael Vick, the Atlanta Falcons quarterback currently in prison, deserves a second chance when he finally gets out, when people have a debate about where are we now with the state of the black quarterback, when no one ever asks about where we are, of course, with the white free safety, even though there are less white free safeties than black quarterbacks. When these questions come up, it really crackles with this question of race and racism. Sometimes it's a shadow discussion, sometimes it gets explicit, but at the very least it's real. It's not segregated in the worlds of left-wing or right-wing talk radio. It's a real community kind of discussion, and I think we need to be able to have something to say about it, because there's a reason why sports today has become this profound mirror, window, kaleidoscope, what have you, on racism. And it's the same reason why we carry the memory of athletes historically at those high moments of racial struggle. I mean, there's a reason why there's an association of the mind with the first African-American heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson, during the period of probably the most entrenched white supremacy that this country had seen at the turn of the century, or Jackie Robinson in the Civil Rights Movement, or Muhammad Ali and Arthur Ashe in the Black freedom struggle of the 60s, or the fact that this is the 40th anniversary of the famed Black Glove Fist salute of Tommy Smith and John Carlos. I mean, they would appreciate that. They weren't clapped 40 years ago. I mean, sports has been this remarkable public sphere where we judge the gap between the promise of America and the reality of America, between the professed ideals of meritocracy and then the enduring reality. So fast forward to today, and I'll end on this point. What does looking at sports tell us? What is the discussion right now? And I think now what it's really a story about is a story of disappearance. And there's a way when you can look at the state of the African-American athlete where you can look at a much broader crisis that's in our society right now. The sports sociologist, Dr. Harry Edwards, he calls the African-American athlete the canary in the mine shaft. And I really got a ring of that when Noel Ignatiev, earlier today, when he spoke about African-Americans not being economically necessary to the United States and what the ramifications and repercussions of that. If you look at sports right now, 20 years ago, 25% of the players were African American. Today it's under 8%. Basketball, lowest percentage of African American players historically. And this is the canary in the mine shaft, because what it's a question of when you look at sports and what people are really starting to call the vanishing African American athlete, what it's really about is the vanishing of infrastructure in our cities, the vanishing of rec programs, the vanishing of physical education in our schools, that become gym class becoming a privilege and not a right for our young people. And I want to make this point and underline it and end on that point, because this isn't just about robbing us of our future entertainers. This isn't just about saying, gee, we're not going to get the next Michael Jordan because there's no PE in an inner-city public school. It's nothing that trite. But what it's about is opening up the space and opportunity for young people to feel like they have options, to learn values of teamwork and harmony, and to feel like they have an opportunity to dream. And for far too many people, that does not exist right now, and that's really what has to change. If we're ever going to get beyond this institutionalization of racism, it's going to be because people see that they have opportunity. And when even in sports they see those doors being closed, that can have very, very diabolical repercussions for all of us. Thank you very much.
I intend to overlook your compliment of my skills.
I'm glad we didn't let you get away here. Our panel, our presenters today, our thought leaders to begin our conversation, are some of America's top media and entertainment personalities. And they go beyond just media and entertainment. Lou Gossett Jr. is the Academy Award winner for Best Supporting Actor for An Officer and a Gentleman, the Emmy Award winner for Roots, and the founder of the Eracism Foundation. Marjorie Valbrun is a journalist and contributing writer to TheRoot.com and one of the contributors to Newsweek's outstanding issue on race in America. Sally Quinn is one of America's best-known journalists and authors, and you'll also be hearing her tomorrow as she moderates our panel on religion and spirituality. And today she's agreed to join us as a panelist on media and film. Commenting will be Joe Madison, the host of the Joe Madison Show, the Black Eagle, with one of the highest audiences in the United States. And we're delighted that Joe Klein is here with us. We're hoping that you'll be able to stay and offer us some comments and just wave your card if we're getting close to the time you go, because we'd love to have you comment as well. And it's my pleasure then to turn it over to Louis Gossett Jr.
Thank you. I'm not going to pretend to write scripts and stuff and do debates like that. I haven't done it in the last couple of years that I've spoken at the universities and places. I feel that I've gotten to the place where I can trust what comes from my heart, let it come out of my mouth. But first, I'd like to say, I'm talking about show business and our magazine covers and our news, the couple of the year is sitting to my left. I would like to see them on the magazine covers, because that's what America's got to be like. That's it. Yeah. Oh, boy. That's what it should look like. Well, I'm going to tell you a little story. I'll do it as fast as I possibly can. I grew up in Coney Island, Brooklyn, Coney Island, in a mixed neighborhood, Sheepshead Bay, Coney Island, right after the Depression. And the thing that we had in common is everybody was poor. Something strange happened to this country when things were poor. Racism was at its minimum. Everybody was hungry. So if my parents didn't get home at 5 o'clock at night, I had a choice. I could have gefilte fish, lasagna, roast beef and cabbage, or gefilte fish. It depends on who got home. And I was in my friends' bathtubs. Anyway, to make a long story short, those are still my friends today, those who have survived. And so that's a 50 and 60-year friendship. Something about the nurturing of that family, of those neighborhoods in Brooklyn and in Bronx, something happened that created a new kind of thing in theater. The Arthur Millers, the Carole Kings, the Neil Sedakas, and the Neil Diamonds, and the Barry Manilow's, et cetera, et cetera. We took over. So I was raised in that society, and in that society was very ideal. I was African-American, and as an African-American, I was cherished and celebrated, as the Italians were celebrated, and we celebrated one another. So I have a very strange kind of upbringing in America in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s of nutrition, of taking care of one another. So it was not until I was maybe 19 or 20 that I really knew what racism was. Trying to join Dr. King and not letting a dog bite me. And so they sent me home. But because I was further than that, I was a free man. And I was the first African-American, et cetera. High school, junior high school, student body. My mother was a student body president. And so we took care of one another. You take this dynamic to California when Hollywood left, it was a different ballgame. So this star that this William Morris agency sent me and took me to the Beverly Hills Hotel, and I was the first African-American to be in the presidential suite that had a Ford Galaxy 400, and I was top of the line. I had the top down on Sunset Boulevard in 1968. It took me 6 hours to get from that car place to the hotel. I had to know every cop on that street. So now, here I am at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and I get the presidential suite that had corned beef, and then I had prime rib, and Yorkshire pudding, and strawberry shortcake, and I was full. I decided to go out and take a look at the movie star's home, and they handcuffed me to a tree for 3 hours. So that was my abject feeling of Hollywood the first time. It's the first movie of the week in the Universal. So I got respect from Universal and William Morris Agency, but the city of Los Angeles was not particularly ready. So it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks, and I went from there to the Academy Award for Emmys because my childhood I just was not to be denied. But still, in getting an Oscar and getting an Emmy, nothing substantial happened to my life. I grew up with George C. Scott and Marlon Brando and Paul Newman and all my best friends, James Dean, and I got to see them do Caesar and Cleopatra and Julius and Napoleon and all the gladiators, and I said, wow, when I win an Oscar, I'm going to do Julius Nyeri. I'm going to do Kwame Nkrumah. I get a chance to play these Buffalo Soldiers, and it didn't happen. The best that has ever happened to me is I played second to my friend Chuck Norris, second to my friend Dennis Quaid, and second to my friend James Wood. They got the money, they got the dressing room, and they got the treatment. My children are watching. If they don't see possibly on any screen our history, our Buffalo Soldiers, the Three Kings of Haiti, the Ashanti Empire, Hannibal, all of these people that I was taught by my elder actors that made me rich, if our children and all children don't see the possible depiction of our history, they say, well, we didn't do anything. They leave the screen and they make immature decisions amongst one another, and one of them is gangbanging, and they think that womanizing is the best thing to do. How many women you can have, how many babies you can have, to die at 21. That is in a microcosm. Now, when Hollywood does films that we have done something in, like Patton, I had two uncles in those tank battalions. If it was not for Patton, those were not our soldiers, our heroes. He sent them to North Africa to beat the Desert Fox, And as a result, he put them against the Panzer Division in Europe, and they beat both. There's been 10 movies about Patton and about the Red Ball Express with only one African-American actor. I had to speak up. So henceforth, I don't do major movies in Hollywood because I've spoken up. Right. But I have children today. They must know the truth. So if they don't want to do them in Hollywood, I'd rather do them in a documentary in my foundation, which is why I'm here today, ladies and gentlemen. We have a shrinking world. All children must know about everybody. We must celebrate one another like my childhood. And that's how we get rid of racism, by consciously getting rid of it in our presence, making that commitment, regardless of the odds, and then teaching only our positives to those children. And when they come out, things will get better one generation at a time. I love the business I'm doing in Hollywood. And I love some of the movies and some of my contemporaries, but they're not doing us any justice. We need to charge them with going back to raising the consciousness of our American public and our world by telling the truth and doing relevance on that screen. They have to be a step ahead of us, not a step behind. So, on that note, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to listen to what you got to say.
Marjorie, Janet will be back very shortly after this commercial message. Marjorie, before we turn to you, I did just want to say that Armstrong Williams had been scheduled to speak here, and he was here, and unfortunately his schedule did not permit him to stay. We thank him for having come, and we are delighted, Marjorie, to turn to you.
Well, I don't believe that there's any more powerful influences on race relations than the media and the film industry. In ways big and small, subtle and obvious, beneficial and detrimental, they are powerful shapers of public opinion and powerful drivers of public policy. So how we think about race, how we perceive people of different races, how we interpret and process racial incidents are all influenced by how race and racial groups are covered in the news and depicted in film. So the media, and to a lesser extent the film industry, has, I believe, pushed this country to deal with racial issues in a way that we might not normally do at the pace that we have. And it's also pushed the country to examine its conscience and to live up to its best ideals, I believe. The Rodney King beatings, the O.J. Simpson trial, Hurricane Katrina, the rape allegations against the Duke lacrosse team, the dragging of James Byrd in Texas. These are just, recent examples of racial incidents that dominated the public discourse and forced us to grapple with race collectively. And as painful as they were, and even as irresponsible and inaccurate and biased the coverage sometimes was, I still believe that these incidents drove many Americans to look within themselves and to look at our government and demand that it do better and live up to its, its stated ideals, as I said before. When I saw those black bodies floating and rotting in the streets of New Orleans after Katrina, I thought about how impossible they were to ignore and how those images, even though they were so different, reminded me of black children being hosed and bitten by dogs during the civil rights movement. Not that they had anything in common, it's that they were just so dramatic and they were so profound and so compelling. And I think that they, collectively outraged the country. But they illustrated the acute failure of our government. And as it either sat by passively and allowed these things to happen, or as it officially or unofficially sanctioned those things to happen. In one time period, we had government attacking a certain segment of its population, and another, we have a government ignoring it. The news coverage of those events was troubling, but it was also immensely effective because it shamed and outraged Americans and embarrassed the presidency and administration. And I believe ultimately it brought Americans together. I think that the outpouring of goodwill that Katrina brought out in this country was a really good thing, where people were saying, oh my gosh, we have to do something about this. I didn't know that there were fellow Americans who lived like this. People invited people into their homes that they never would normally have. And people, I think, really reach for the best of their humanity. And so I cite some of these more blatant events that get the most attention and hype because they involve race. We know that the attention they garner is not very long-lasting, and it just moves on to the next scandal or the next tragedy. But the significance they are given is important because they ultimately force the news media to examine them as important social issues, and eventually when Hollywood does films about these events or documentaries, to treat them as important cultural touchstones. So in a sense, the media and the film industry are driven by racial issues just as much as they drive the public discourse on racial issues. And I'm not even talking about just the specific events I cited, but also such issues as affirmative action, welfare reform, immigration reform, the largely segregated and failing inner city public schools, the widening gap between rich and poor, the growing class divide in this country. These are all factors I believe contribute to the country's racial problems. And though we've come a long way on race relations, they're still very complicated, and we have a long way to go. And I believe the only way to move further and to do better is to keep talking about them and to address them by working to ensure that what is depicted on television and in the movies and in mass media, on the evening news broadcasts and in our newspapers is as fair and accurate as possible, and that and that challenge grows bigger by the day because of the uncontrollable beast that is the internet. But the internet aside, I think that the film and television industry has improved significantly in its portrayal of race. We went from the controversial and racist film, The Birth of a Nation, which was way before my time, but it prompted blacks to demand more accurate and fair representation and portrayals of black people and the black experience in this country. And now we have pleasant but ultimately unforgettable films such as Just Things We Lost in the Fire and Something New. These are commercial films that came and went. And what was interesting about them was that they involved interracial relationships that were just an aside. They weren't even an important factor in the movie. And I think that tells us a lot about where we've come. We went from movies like The Imitation of Life and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner to Roots and to Jungle Fever, which also forced us to look at race directly. And I think all those things are good for America, and I think they're good for the discussions that we're having on race. We can't, the gentleman before who mentioned that we can't ignore the fact that we have a black man running for president, and I agree that's a very unprecedented and important matter. And I think that the reason that the Obama campaign has gotten so much attention is not just because he's a black man, but because what it would say about if he won, what it would say about this country, what it would say about us to each other, what it would say to the world about America. And I think that a lot of Americans like that idea. If it happens, it's a different story, but what will it say about us? And I think that race has driven a lot of the narrative in the campaign because we're just so fascinated by it. I think in America we talk about race so much and we talk around it and we talk beside it. And that's good in a sense because a lot of other places they don't talk about their racial problems and they don't think that they have any racial problems. But I think that if we're really going to get to the root of some of these problems, that we need to not just be talking about them, but actively doing more than having sessions like this, which is very important, but finding ways for us to have more interactions with each other. And I think a big problem is that it seems to me that we are becoming more and more segregated economically and not just, socially anymore. It used to be said that, it was just the church on Sundays was the most segregated hour in American life. But if we look at our public schools and if we look at our neighborhoods, I think that they're just as segregated in many instances, and in other instances they're becoming more segregated. So those are some of the topics that I hope that we'll look at today.
Sally Quinn.
Well, I want to thank Bill and Janet for doing this incredible panel. I think it's an extraordinary event, and I hope it's not the last. I want to start out by telling you a story about a trip I took to Brazil right after Watergate. My husband was the editor of the Washington Post during Watergate, and we wanted to get as far away as we possibly could, so we went to Brazil. It was during Carnival, and we went up to the north of Brazil in Bahia. And Bahia is one of the most mixed race places in all of Brazil. And we were at a carnival party one night, and we were taken by some friends from the university, and there were all these professors and people like that. And I ended up in this long sort of hour-and-a-half discussion over in the corner with this fabulous guy. We were talking, just had the most incredible, interesting conversation. The next day I was telling our host about the conversation, and I couldn't remember his name, and he said, well, can you describe him? Was he black or white? And I said, you know what? I don't remember. And I was so stunned by that, being someone who actually was born in Savannah, Georgia, that I was in this community that was sort of colorblind, that I didn't remember whether this guy was black or white. And it was just, I felt absolutely elated by that, because it was the first time in my life where I hadn't, obviously the first thing, noticed what color somebody was. When I was asked to do this panel, I thought, you know, this panel probably couldn't have taken place, this particular panel, with this discussion 5 years ago, maybe not even 5 months ago. And I have to say that a year ago, I probably would not have agreed to do this because it would be too scary, because I would be afraid to talk about race in any kind of way that was honest. And in fact, one of my friends told me earlier today, be careful what you say. But I wanted to talk about the Washington Post. I've been at the Washington Post for almost 40 years, and I have to say that the Washington Post is probably one of the most progressive newspapers in the country in terms of race, in terms of going out and hiring and training and bringing along black reporters. But in the days when I first started, there were very few black reporters, as there were very few women reporters. I mean, I was in Style and with the women's section. At the beginning of Style, that was sort of the women's ghetto. But the few black reporters who were there were essentially black reporters. They weren't reporters, and they were people that everyone knew had been hired because we needed black reporters and because there were certain slots that were open for black reporters, and they covered black subjects, a lot of them, and they did the stories that were about blacks. And it was sort of an unwritten rule at the Washington Post that, you know, you didn't, in Style, for instance, if you did a profile of a black person, it had to be a positive profile. I mean, so you could do hatchet jobs on anybody as long as they were white, but there was this, which ultimately was very condescending. You had to write only positive pieces. There was a word that went out that we needed more black stories, more stories about black people. And so people would write stories that weren't even particularly interesting. But they were stories about black people because we had to have a certain number of stories about black people. And nobody even sort of thought about it. It was just kind of one of those things that was understood, but it was also a thing that kind of separated people, the black reporters from the white reporters, because it wasn't like you were all working together as a team. I mean, I remember, you know, seeking out and being so pleased if there were some black reporters on the paper who were friends of mine. I remember Roger Wilkins and Bob Maynard, who died but was the editor of the Oakland Tribune, were very close friends of mine, and I was always so proud that I had black friends in those days. I mean, we're talking 35 or almost 40 years ago, but it was something that I made a point of doing, and really that was important to me, that I could be seen as someone who actually had real black friends, and it wasn't just for show. I think this all sort of, this whole attitude was, as I said earlier, a little condescending, and it was also in TV. I did a stint for about 6 months, a totally disastrous stint as the first network anchorwoman in America on CBS Morning News. I bombed completely, but in that period of time, again, there were very few black reporters and on television, and the ones who were black reporters were reporters because they were black. When recently, I mean, not recently, but a while ago, for instance, even as late as a few years ago, or recently as a few years ago, when a certain job came up and a black reporter was not given the job, and there was sort of a lot of anger and consternation at the paper. And I remember one of them went up to see my husband, who is still a vice president at the paper, and he said, you know, this person didn't get the job. And my husband said, do you believe that that person was the best person for the job? And he said, no. And my husband said, you know, you're fighting the wrong fight. And the guy said, you know what, you're right. It was this kind of, he kind of walked away sort of thinking, oh, maybe we should, you know, we haven't, and my husband said, you know, there's so many great black reporters here now. You don't have to fight for one to get a job if that's not the right job for that person. What you want to do is, you know, we need to have the best person, as I'll get to Obama in a minute. But there was a whole way that white reporters treated black colleagues and sources and subjects that was very different. And so you always had this little conflict, a sense of conflict of, you know, our job as journalists is to be open and objective and tell the truth. And yet, when it comes to covering anything, if you're a white reporter covering anything that had to do with a black person or a black subject or a colleague or whatever, that you just didn't, you treated it differently. And I think everyone lived in terror of being accused of being a racist. I know we all did. And people like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton didn't help because they would, the minute anything happened, that they would immediately cry racism, and everybody would go, oh my God, am I really a racist? And, you know, when the phrase African American came into vogue, then nobody knew whether you should say African American or black. And I've just noticed in the last year, even 6 months, that people are saying black now more often than African American. But I'm always a little nervous of which one I should say, in which group, and how I should say it. And I think that, you know, nobody wanted and either still wants to be politically incorrect. You want to do the right thing. You want to think the right thing. I think that this whole situation has changed, and why I say that I don't think we could have had this panel 5 months ago by Barack Obama. And not just that he was a black, but that he was running for president against a number of white candidates and then against a white woman, other liberal candidates. And suddenly there were other politicians, Hillary, as obviously, but also the journalists were put in a position where now they weren't just allowed to write negative things about a black politician, but they were forced to criticize him because he did make mistakes. And the liberals who were running against Obama were actually forced to criticize him. So it was one of these sort of incredible moments in this country where we're seeing a major black person actually being treated like a real person instead of a person of color that treated the way the other white politicians were being treated. And it was, I think, very liberating because Obama understood this and responded in a way that was incredibly sort of open-minded and gracious about it. I mean, there were very few moments where Obama would say, this is racist or that's racist. I mean, he was very, I think, clearly understood that this was going to be a difficult moment for everybody. I mean, including the Clintons. You know, Bill Clinton, the first black president, ended up being a pariah in some people's eyes because he criticized Obama, but criticized him unfairly. I think that the most important thing, one of the most important things that I've ever seen is Obama's speech on racism that he gave in Philadelphia, because I think it changed everything for not just the media in this country, but for all of us in our way of looking at black people and looking at looking at the situation of racism. It opened up the doors and the windows, it turned on the lights, and it made the media and everyone else rethink how they looked at race and how they thought about race. I really believe that that will go down, his speech, as one of the most important speeches in American political history. And I don't think I've ever been quite so moved by anything in my life as I was by that. But what was most exciting to me was that he gave all of us the right to discuss race in a real, honest, and truthful way, which we had never been able to do before. And that we could discuss it in this panel, as we're doing in this panel, without guilt, without embarrassment, without shame. And overnight, it changed. Overnight, I was hearing conversations that I had never heard before on television, on the radio, in social events, where people were actually talking about race in a way that was open and honest and true. And suddenly, you noticed more black reporters on television and commentators, and you also realized that they were there not because they were black, but because they were really good. And so it changed your whole perception of blacks in America. One's, certainly white Americans' perceptions of blacks in America, and I think even blacks' perceptions of blacks in America. And I obviously am not the right person to speak about that. I think that in terms of the media coverage of Jeremiah Wright, it's probably, in my 40 years of journalism, the worst coverage I have ever seen of any story. I think that it was underreported, overreported in the worst possible way, misreported, and I think it showed an extraordinary lack of understanding, not only on the part of the media, and I'm talking about all the media, but on the part of the American people, too, about racism. You know, you have two 20-second sound bites of Jeremiah Wright, this man who had a 36-year history of extraordinary work, and we won't get into the psychological problems that he, you know, and his problems with Obama and whatever you want to say about that, but that it opened a window on a kind of, and we can get into this a little bit tomorrow, religion and a religious life and an attitude about the way we live our lives that Americans had never seen before, white Americans had never been, and were shocked and appalled, and the press never explained it. I mean, nobody ever explained it. Nobody said, this is what this is about. This is why this is happening. There's nothing wrong with this. And I mean, honestly, I feel, I mean, on our website, we really tried to do as much as we could about this, and I wrote about it, but people, I would go to dinners and people would say, you know, this is an outrage, this is appalling, this is extraordinary. And I don't think the press has yet, and I think the press still has a lot of work to do on that kind of coverage, because I think it was really a scandal in a way, and I think it's still going on. But now, at least we have made these kinds of gains. We've got this conference, which I think is the beginning of something really important. You know, it used to be around the newsroom, and not only just in the newsroom, people would say, you know, he or she was black. And that would sort of tell you everything you need to know. And then people would say, well, they're black, but they're really nice. And then it got to be, they're black and they're really nice. And now it's sort of, they're black, meaning it's okay. And I just look forward to the day where people don't have to identify people by what color they are. And I just look forward to the day when I can say I was on this extraordinary panel with someone like Lou Gossett, and someone will say, well, what color is he? And I'll say, I don't remember. Thank you.
Before we open this up, we have Joe and Joe. And Joe Madison, we're going to give you the final word for the presenters, if that's all right. We'll ask Joe Klein to speak briefly, and we'll conclude the presenters with Joe Madison, and then we will open it up.
Okay. Thank you, and apologies in advance for having to come and go. Thanks, Janet and Bill, for opening your marriage to the rest of us. And I mean, if we could all be part of, if this whole country could be part of your marriage, it would be such a wonderful place. You know, I live, one of the reasons why I have to go is that I'm in the middle of this political campaign. You may have heard about it. And I live a political life, but I guess we all do. I mean, from the 60s, the personal is political. I have a political family. All of my children voted for Barack Obama, and my mother isn't sure yet whether or not he's a Muslim terrorist. I'm trying to work on her a little. But I do want to talk about something personal, and then I want to talk about something political. The personal story is how I really learned to live with and to come to grips with racial differences. I'm married to a design fascist. And back in the beginning of the 80s, we had a choice of buying a boring house in a safe neighborhood or buying a really interesting house in a neighborhood that the white residents called Clinton Hill and the black residents called Bedford-Stuyvesant. And so we chose the interesting house. And a lot of my neighbors, we were a very distinct minority there. I remember white cab drivers refusing to take me there. A lot of my neighbors were middle class. A lot of my neighbors were underclass. And I think that one of the things I became really conscious of, and I'm going to speak frankly here, was the incredible pressure on the black middle class in this country. The fact that they were infuriated by the irresponsibility of their underclass neighbors and by the fact that they were often mistaken for them, and that they were infuriated by white people who often mistook them for the underclass. I remember, Saturday nights, we all had young kids. We'd get together. We'd put on those baby monitors. The kids would be upstairs, and we'd be downstairs drinking, and we'd be talking about various merchants. And I'd say, you know, that Italian butcher over on Fulton Street has really good meat. And everybody would start laughing and say, maybe for you, fella, but not for us. And I realized that it wasn't until I could start really yelling and getting angry at the black craftsmen who came in to work on our house that I had somehow surmounted my racial inhibitions. I remember, a true breakthrough. We had a Rastafarian group doing the brownstone on our house and doing a terrible job of it. And one day, I was in an argument on the front stoop with this guy who was accusing me of being a plantation master and all kinds of stuff. And my neighbor next door, who was a buyer at Macy's, came out, and she looked at the guy, and she said, everybody on this block knows you're doing a lousy job. Why don't you just shut up and get to work? And it taught me a number of things, but it also taught me that as difficult as life was for my black middle-class friends, they had a way out. When crack came in 1987, we all left. When crack came in and people would break into the back seat of your car to take out the baby seat because they could get $5 for it and buy a vial of crack, that happened to me. That happened to my friend Ernest Sage, who lived around the corner, who was an architect for New York City. And all of us, sadly, left. A lot of my black neighbors went down south. We went out to the burbs. And we lost something. We lost something precious that I really miss. The synergy of all of us being together, and the way that our different ways of perceiving the world could bounce off of each other. That's my personal story. The political point I want to make is this, that we may be talking about, I wonder who that phone call's from. Sorry about that.
You're not running for president, are you?
You know, earlier I heard people talking about the need to really improve education in the inner cities and for the poor. But we have to improve education for all of us. We have to really improve education for white people in this country. I named a character in Primary Colors after this concept, Orlando Ozio, the governor of New York. Ozio, Machiavelli once said, Ozio is the greatest enemy of a republic. Ozio is Italian for indolence. Machiavelli was really worried about what happens to a republic when it doesn't have the discipline of war. And we've endured the world's longest experiment in Ozio since the end of World War II. And during that time, you know, we've had wars, but they weren't existential wars. We've had unprecedented prosperity. And during that time, I think we've lost the habits of citizenship. And I think that one of the things that I'm feeling from the younger people now, the people that I've watched as Obama organizers out in the States and the people who are flocking to meetings, political meetings this year, is a desire to become citizens again. We have to regain a sense of rigor. We have to acknowledge the really insidious effects of commercialism on our kids, you know, and yes, it affects the poor more. I mean, Adam Smith, you know, once wrote that a rich man and a poor man can go out and get drunk. The rich man can stay home the next day and it doesn't affect his life at all. And the poor man will get fired. And I think that I'm never more aware of the effects of the commercial culture than when I'm in a housing project where the one piece of furniture that you hear in every apartment, see in every apartment, is a giant television set, and where children never experience silence. I think that until we really and if we can't really get our act together again, white and black and Latino, if we can't see our way past all of this commercialism and prosperity, if we can't do that, and if we can't really start working hard at being citizens again, I really fear for our future. Having said that, let me say that this is my 9th presidential campaign. God help me. They don't have 12-step programs for political junkies. And it's a bookend campaign in many ways for me. My second one, maybe this will be my next to last. My second one was the campaign of 1980, where I kept on running into Democrats at Republican meetings saying, we're sick of those guys. We're sick of the Democrats. We're switching over. This year, I see an awful lot of Republicans coming to Democratic meetings. And so I'm hopeful. I've never seen a time in this country before when more than 80% of the people think it's moving on the wrong track. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that since September 11th, I've been spending a lot of my time trying to learn about the region, Islam, the military, and intelligence. And General Jones, the military, is the great example of a rigorous, strongly moral institution with values very much like the ones I'd like to see inculcated in my children, of service and sacrifice that provides universal health care and universal education benefits. And it's been a privilege. It's been the great privilege of my career as a journalist to be downrange with them in places like Iraq and to watch them back here and to see a truly colorblind society. And final note is, my son this year is 18 years old. He was a junior in high school. And he had a roommate, and I heard everything in the world about this roommate, about what a jerk he was, about how wonderful he was, about how they were studying together, about how the roommate was trying to undermine him. And it wasn't until I showed up to take my son home that I met the roommate and found out there was one other fact about him that I didn't know. He was black. I look at my kids, and I look at all the people like them, and I can't help, and we should never forget how far we've come and how optimistic we should be about the future. And now I'm sorry I have to leave.
Oh, thank you.
Joe Madison.
Every single day, 6 to 10 a.m. on my radio show, we discuss every issue that has come up here, every single day. I sit with interest when I hear people say that these discussions don't take place. They take place on the Power, on Joe Madison's show, and have for the last 30 years that I've been doing talk radio. I have said over and over again, in America, we are culturally conditioned to believe that white is superior, black is inferior, and the manifestation of that cultural conditioning is that we too often, as black people, are undervalued, underestimated, and marginalized. And I've asked everyone who disagrees and wants to engage in the debate to call me, and I'll give them 4 hours on the air with me. Lou Gossett is part of culture. Movies are part of our culture. Your religion is part of your culture. What you wear, Italian suits. What you eat, German food. What you have on your feet, good Italian leather. It's cultural conditioning. Our American history, someone mentioned it. Strange. How can slaves listen to white patriots talk about freedom and wondering, what are these crazy white people talking about? Freedom? They are free. We're the ones that are not free. It's cultural conditioning. Only black person I ever learning about the Revolutionary War was Crispus Attucks. Hell, I'm running around wanting to be a Minuteman. No one told me about the thousands of black patriots who fought in the Revolutionary War. No one bothered to tell me that the British offered freedom to my ancestors before the American revolutionists, and it was George Washington. No one told me about the Massachusetts men who fought until there was a cultural movie that shook us all, Glory. And Lord help us when Roots came on ABC. We had people naming our children Kunta Kinte. Walking outside in the middle of the night, holding baby boys up to the stars. It's cultural conditioning. I'm at a restaurant. Black man from Texas talking to his friend. I'm overhearing it. It's nice being on radio. People don't know what you look like. Unless you're on Lou Dobbs almost every week. And he has a son. He says, my son wants to be a businessman. He's got a scholarship to MIT and Florida A&M. I swear I hope he takes it to MIT. And I'm saying he wants to be a businessman, and he wants his son to go to MIT. And I'm saying, wait a minute. I just did an interview where Florida A&M had one of the top business schools in the United States, black or white. But he had heard of MIT because the president or the experts who come on television, commentators, are not from Florida A&M. When Watergate took place, constitutional crisis, Bill Clinton, the professors to discuss constitutional issues came from Harvard and Yale, and that's great promotion on their part in one of the greatest constitutional law schools in America, just a few miles from here, Howard University Law School, that gave us some of the greatest constitutional lawyers. It's cultural conditioning. And we are too often assume we are undervalued, underestimated, and marginalized. Why are all three anchors following Barack Obama overseas? Well, first reason is that networks got rid of their foreign bureaus. And they had something called, now they got something called infotainment. Started 20 years ago. We're going to take news and we're going to make it part information and part entertainment, and what you've got now is infotainment. And so when I'm on Lou Dobbs or I'm on Campbell Brown or I'm on Sean Hannity, I've got producers in my ears telling me, mix it up, mix it up, mix it up. Forget about the high level of public dialogue that we're supposed to have when we're talking about important issues like Israel and the Palestinians like we did this morning. Y'all mix it up, mix it up. Infotainment. And so there's a dumbing down of American. And on the issue of race, CNN, special on race. It ought to be every damn day we should be talking about it, not a special. You want a reality show? Instead of having a bunch of wild kids in a dormitory somewhere, I'll tell you what, let's take a kid, let's take a family. Instead of wife swapping, let's take a family from Potomac, Maryland, or Turtle Creek, Michigan. And let's move them on to southeast Washington, D.C., where I live, and let them live for 90 days over there. And then let's take the kids and the family from southeast and move them out to Potomac and let them live out there. You're going to have reconciliation. It's cultural conditioning. How many have heard of the Angola 3? Huh? You got 3 men, 36 years. In solitary confinement for a crime they never committed in one of the largest prisons in the United States, in Angola, Louisiana. Who does a study? So when I call up and say, when they say, well, Mr. Madison, are there any issues you'd like to talk about today once we get through our list? And I say, yeah, how about the Angola 3? Well, we might be able to get to it. How many Ronnie White in Prince George's County? He accused of killing a police officer, ends up killed in his prison cell, asphyxiated, bones broken in his neck, and most people around the country haven't heard about it. Winfield, Louisiana, a young man tasered 9 times. Case happened just in January. He died on the 9th taser. And the police, and this is only a few miles from Gina, Louisiana. And Michael Savage. 3.6 million people listen to him every morning. And what did he do the other day? Children who are autistic, they're just brats whose parents need to tell him to shut up and behave. and he's sponsored by some of the major corporations in America. It's cultural conditioning. This time last year, we're wringing our hands over the fact that there was homicide, outrageous homicide rates in Philadelphia. But what no one reported was that 54% of the black men in Philadelphia, 18 to 25, unemployed. 54%. Wake up tomorrow morning and let the Washington Post report that 54% of white men in Washington, D.C. are unemployed, and all hell would break loose in this city. It's cultural conditioning. If you'd have told me 30 years ago, Janet, that I would be looking at the 3 major networks and there would not be one black anchor, woman, or man, I said, no, not after the Kerner Commission report. That's impossible. That's impossible. It couldn't be. So I say to you, in America and globally, it's cultural conditioning. And we have to address every aspect of what our culture is. I look at like a petri dish. You know, you see a scientist, they drop something in the middle of it, that's the culture. And it depends on what they drop in it, determines what grows. And that's what's been happening. We've been dropping these little bits of poison in it. Nobody should be questioning why media is following a 46-year-old black man whose father, just a generation ago, was a goat herder in the hills of Kenya, is now one footstep away from being not just the President of the United States, Mr. Cohen, Senator Cohen, he is now poised to be the leader of the free world. And you don't think Europe, you don't think Asia, you don't think the world is fascinated by that prospect? That here is a young African American, name's not Kennedy, name's not Bush, and let me make one correction. Bill Clinton was not the first black president of the United States. And if he woke up yesterday with that delusional thought in his mind, Barack Obama is about ready to erase that. We may have the, Yeah, even though Jefferson's in his name. We're about ready to erase that. Let me conclude by this. Somebody made the point about Jeremiah Wright. Ladies and gentlemen, cultural conditioning. Absolutely correct. Take one sound bite, and this is not just white people who do this. Black folk did this. I had a black guy today did this from Las Vegas. He said, you know, man, I just hated what Jeremiah Wright did. What did he do? Based on what? Based on what I heard. A 20-second sound bite that got played over and over, and the most segregated time of the week is Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. Most folk had never heard of black liberation gospel. Most people had never been in a black church. Most commentators didn't know. And if there's the biggest mistake we've made in our newsrooms, be it television or radio, is that we really ought to be teaching, we ought to tell young journalists, minor in journalism, major in history, major in business, major in political science. Really. Really, I'm serious. I mean, I was going to interview. I was talking. I said, well, you know, we ought to get Jim Browne on this program, the next program, because Jim Brown's got this excellent program in California where he's taking gang members, black and white, and he's changing their lives. And the little producer, God bless her, said, "Who's Jim Browne?" You know, look, do me a favor. Don't ever say that outside of radio. You know, they don't know. They really, honestly, don't know. Obama's not the first person. And say what you want about Jesse Jackson, but you know, thank God Jesse Jackson ran for president of the United States, because Obama wouldn't have been able to run for president. Thank God Shirley Chisholm ran for president, Dick Gregory ran for president of the United States. And finally, I'll say this to you. Obama is not running for president of Black America. Obama, Jeremiah was right. We may have to, if Obama becomes president, we may have to kick his butt, because he's president of the United States of America. And he's going to have all the problems and all the issues of every American there is, and we're going to have to stand up and fight for what we want. We're going to have our own agendas, liberal and conservatives. And for liberals and conservatives who get in the media, please let me tell you this. This thing about personal responsibility versus public policy, it's not one or the other. It's a combination of both. Liberals think too often that it's all public policy. Conservatives think it's all personal responsibility. It's a combination, really, of both. And it's trying to find a balance. I'll conclude by saying something that I heard, I think it was Martin Luther King. What we need to do in here, all of us of like minds, and we're all of like minds, should always remember, whether it's Darfur, whether it's Vivian. You know, Sharon didn't tell you. After, you know, we all think that her sister got great media attention. Most of the cameras weren't there. When Martin Luther King got his Nobel Peace Prize, you know, only one magazine went and covered it, and that was Ebony. But what she did not tell you, that she told me on my show, and I didn't even realize that, was the next day. After your, listen, the same night, the day that her sister was refused entrance to the University of Alabama, that night, Medgar Evers was shot in his driveway. We will long forget what our enemies say, but we will remember forever the silence of our friends. Yes. Thank you. Yes.
We have a number of people who've asked to comment, and we are unfortunately, we're going to let everybody, as many people as we can, comment. We are under the time constraint that we must be out of this room within the next 20 minutes in order for us to be able to set up for the presentation. So in doing that, I have written down all of the names that I have seen. Some of you have spoken already. For those who have spoken already, I would ask that you keep your comments short in order to let those who have not yet had a chance to speak be able to comment. And for those who have not yet been able to comment, I would also ask that you keep your comments short and keep within a couple of minutes, because we will have an opportunity at the reception and tomorrow, and we look at this as not the end, but just the beginning of a discussion. And so with that, on my list, I have promised Don Moore, Gerald Talbot, Bruce Jacobs, and Michael Liberty, and William Smith the opportunity to speak from the last session. I'm also going to call on Amanda Sage, Jay Lavender, Mary Farrell, Cliff Alexander, LaToya Foster, Murray Horowitz, and Tom Allen. And Deepak, you will get the last word. Yes, yeah, I did say that. So, Don Moore. Mike.
Two mics. I just want to say thank you to the Cohens for this opportunity and this wonderful dialogue. My question might have been more relevant to the last session, but I think maybe tangentially it is connected. My question is there a disincentive for the white power structure to sort of equalize the playing field? Is there a collective unconscious amongst the power structure in the 21st century to allow the gaps to continue to persist?
I think the answer to that would be Professor Walters. He has written about it and points out that every time the black community starts to make progress and it seems to be infringing upon the privilege of the white community, they shut it down. And that goes on, and he would point it out from 1971 forward. That started to take place. So you can look at it historically in his last book that we had up on the screen, and you'll find the answer to that.
May I? There seems to be a different ballgame today, though. It's ironically, the lesson has been taught by our hip-hoppers and our rap. When they were locked out of the recording industry, now they own it because they found other ways to sell their product. So I think the name of the game is not race, but money. So that if you can prove that you can make money, it doesn't matter what it is, you become part of the infrastructure. So we're suffering from a monetary thing. So that today, the African-American dollar is up to maybe about 60 billion. And we don't spend it on ourselves. So let's not talk about the other guy these days because there are other ways to do things. Let's look at ourselves. And maybe we should invest in ourselves to show the businessman that we too can make money. Then the man who is in charge will call us on the phone and say, let's do business together. So we have to not blame so much. Let's take care of ourselves a little bit. We do have the wherewithal. So let's balance that out a little bit. We do have the power to do that today.
I just want to respond to your question. I don't know if it's an answer, but it's all about power, more than pigmentation, really. It's about power. And people who have power are not willing to surrender it very easily. So I think that might be the answer. So those of us without the power need to utilize the tools. And we've discussed what those are: education, enlightenment.
Dr. Martin Luther King was asked once, how would you define integration? And he said it is the sharing of power, resources, and responsibility. It didn't make any difference who you lived next door to. It wasn't about going to school and learning through osmosis. Really, what segregationists in America and the world tried, and they did in South Africa, what they really tried to segregate was power, resources, and the responsibility that goes with power and resources. And that's what real integration is all about.
Jerry Talbot.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I thank you. I appreciate it very much, Janet, Bill, and Doug. It's really an honor and an education. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to throw a little story around. And I agree with Lou Gossip in what he's saying. I support that 100%. But what I would like to do is I'd like to pass a story through to you, and that is in 1868, two white women were murdered. Two white women were murdered. And a white man and a black man were arrested. And the black man had very little, if any, education. But they took him to court, which was very quick. They found him guilty, and he went to jail. In fact, he went to prison. He went to prison for those two murders, all right? He stayed in prison, and pretty soon he went to death row. He went to death row, and he was, to make a long story short, he went to death row, stayed there about a year. He was the youngest and the only black to ever be hung in the state of Maine, in the state of Maine. And the reason why he was hung is the state of Maine legislature couldn't come to an answer whether they should have the death or shouldn't have the death, because the death penalty was in the state of Maine. They couldn't come to that. So the governor took it upon himself to say, well, we're going to have to put him to death. So in 1869, they did. They put a white hat on his head, a hood, and they hung him. They hung him. Then the state of Maine got its brains together and said, no, 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 no more. No more. And we have never had the death penalty since that time. In what he did, he went over, or the governor went over, 11 people on death row to put him to death. Now, the 11 people were also on death row for murder, for rape, for robbery, or whatever. And that goes along with what everybody's talking about, all right? Whether it deals with education, whether it deals with economics, whether it deals with politics, whether it deals with racism, all right? And that will come down to my last word, and then I'll be quiet. And that is a fact that you can also get an education. You can also get an education as far as black people do exist in the state of Maine. Black people do live in the state of Maine. They helped. They helped build the state of Maine. They helped build this country. And you can also go out front, open the door, and go out here and buy a book that says Maine's Visible Black History. Thank you.
Bruce Jacobs, then Michael Liberty.
I was going to tell Janet a speaking story about West Virginia that'll give you another reason to want to go, but I'm going to save that for another time and move on to quickly say two things. One is I can't resist saying two sentences about the Reverend Wright thing. Okay. One is I can't resist saying a couple of words about the Reverend Wright thing, which I think in the media and in political culture in general, the way it's been treated, has a lot to do with what I call the bad N theory. That is, some of you may know, if there's a black man who you don't mess with, who is known to make trouble, who's a really kind of bad character, there's this phrase that he's a bad N. All right, you can complete the word. And I think that there is a suspicion and a fear among one kind of slice of the white body politic that there is a bad N lurking somewhere in this nice, smiling, non-threatening Barack Obama waiting to get out. I think there's some anxiety around that, and I think that Reverend Wright was kind of a surrogate for that character in the Obama campaign, and we might see more of that. I'm not the only person to talk about this, but it's something that I've seen. I also want to quickly say that when you talk about how media shape racial attitudes, Noam Chomsky, linguist, a lot of you I'm sure know, and Edward Herman talked about what they call manufactured consent, which is the idea that if you flood people with a narrow enough amount of information, they will make decisions that feel like choices that are in fact coerced choices. They're not real choices. And I think that's what goes on with a lot of our racial attitudes because of the consolidated, centralized corporate media culture that we have today in this country. I'll just briefly give one example and then let it go. I live in Baltimore. What we're used to seeing in coverage, for example, what largely informs the suburban white sensibility about young black men is this sequence of present-day event-based murder stories. Young black man does awful thing. Next day on the front page, another young black man does another awful thing. So there's this perpetual present in which this succession of awful things done by young black men is reported without what I call the backstory. The Baltimore Sun did a backstory story where they tracked the life of one young black man in the projects who did a succession of horrific things. And they started on the day when he came down the elevator in the projects where he lived and found his father on the floor in the lobby in a pool of blood. And they took it from there. I have a friend who's a neuropsychologist who does research in trauma theory, what she calls trauma theory, which has to do with the actual effect on the brain when an infant from birth undergoes a succession of experiences of emotional trauma. And one of the results is they end up without things that we take for granted, like empathy, like self-esteem. So we don't get this backstory in a lot of the media coverage that we get from our corporate media, who are informed by a profit-driven, centralized sensibility. And I think we need it. So what I'm suggesting is that number one, we think about that. That number two, we regulate media ownership. There's actually a serious movement for media reform in this country. They have a convention every year. The last time I went, there were 5,000 people there. So there's a serious movement to reform American media. Secondly, that we demand more from news coverage and from our media punditry. I won't even get into what I call the rage talk industry. I'll just leave that alone. And thirdly, I think we have to be our own media in a certain way. I don't think we can rely on filtered versions of one another's identities. I think we need to start to talk to one another, which is what we're here for, to find out who we actually are. And I'll leave it at that.
We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. Michael?
First off, thank you for inviting me today. And I've been blessed to know Secretary Cohen for 30 years. I met him when I was 18 years old. And he's been a mentor, advisor, father figure, and just an inspiration to me my entire life.
And he's a good basketball player.
Yeah. He keeps bringing that up. But I have to say that, you know, this is like, to me, this is an extraordinary event, and it's really just not a surprise given Janet and Bill. And they've lived their lives as servant leaders, and that's what I think of when I think of them. And they inspire me to think in terms of leadership. That's what we're all here about today. The real challenge is, do we go from here today and take this servant leadership DNA that they've lived with their whole lives and are transferring to us, and actually step up to the plate and carry with it and go with an agenda, and, as you know, Lou says, you know, really speak the truth about it, face the music, that we live in a really racist society. I lived and grew up and still live in Maine part of the time. I grew up in a racist family. My mother was Irish Catholic from Boston, came from privilege, raised to be afraid of black people. My father was French Canadian. Didn't like black people, didn't understand why, just didn't, because he didn't know anything about it because he was ignorant. And that's really what we're talking about, is for racism to go away, a white man has to stand up and say, it can't be. And it's got to be really a sincere campaign where we stand up and call people out. I have a rage against racism. I have a black son. I want my son to have a future that everybody deserves. Everybody's equal, without color, because I don't see color and I never have. First taste of it I got was when I was 14 years old and I was living in a trailer. And I went to basketball camp, and I had this really dear friend. Developed a bond with him. He's a 6'11" black kid from New York City. And I played basketball, and I wanted to win a state championship, so I was like, gee, if he could live with me, we could really probably win 4 state championships. And I brought him home to Maine because we were at camp together, and he didn't have a mother, he didn't have a father. He was living at the Christ the King halfway house in New York City. And I brought him to Maine. I brought him to one of the people in my town that I looked up to, and thought he'd be excited. And he wasn't excited. And when my friend was out of earshot, he said to me, you can't have that coon live with you. And that was really a shattering moment for me, because it said, wow, that can't be. But it is, and it still exists in this world. And I've had great success in my career, and I've had failure. And all along the way, I've seen it every step of the way. And I've made a commitment a long time ago that any time I see it, I jump on it. And I address it, and I don't allow it to go unanswered. And Joe, you're unbelievable, and I'm a friend, and I'll never, ever not speak up. And that's what this whole campaign's about, is to get leadership through the servant leadership of these two amazing people to call to action and to take action, not just talk about it and, geez, gosh, let's not do it, it's uncomfortable. I think making people uncomfortable is the way to address the issue, is to face the music and say, we live in a racist society, and make white people stand up and educate their kids and be excited for them to learn about the atrocities that took place that gave rise to all this horrific divisiveness that's existed, and move the country to the next level, move the world to a better place. That's what I think happens today. It's a beginning. It's not an end. And, you know, you two are just really, truly amazing. Put this event together is extraordinary. And I'm just very flattered to be a part of it, and just hope and pray that this can be the beginning of, I know what's going to be, the campaign that that Janet has with Ann and Emmett. You're going to learn about that tonight, and that's going to be a nationwide enlightenment tour, I guess is the best way I can see it. And well, I'm just really flattered to be here. Thank you very much.
And we just ask if you could keep the remarks short now. William Smith.
Thank you. I'll just be brief, touch on 4 things quickly. One, Lou, in terms of Patton, the 761st, that speech that he gave, that George C. Scott gave when your great-grandchildren are sitting around the campfire and they ask him what you did in this man war, you won't say you shoveled shit in Louisiana? That speech was taken exactly from a talk that Patton gave to Leonard Smith and the other tankers in the 761st. And they used a line from the speech and never showed only one black guy, as you said, and he was polishing Patton's helmet. So, yeah, the valet, exactly. But more to the notion of the power of media, and I only because I'm a media guy really, though I was somehow got in the education ring. The 4 things that prop up the table of democracy: law, education, finance, and communication. Those are the things that this table rests on. Of those 4 things, the most powerful is communication, which includes media. It shapes and breaks everything, all of them. So that work that we talk about and that we do, to the extent that we can change communication, to me, exponentially is how quickly we can change this country. So I'm saying that to those young men from the Academy, if they're still here, you might want to look into communication as a field of study, because there's power there. There's power to make great change. So keep that in mind. Lastly, this meeting is in the, it just bears out the thesis of my mentor, Dr. Richard Thomas over at Michigan State University. His thesis is called The Other Tradition, and it says that so much in life and in our history, we talk about all the things that happen to keep us apart, but the grinding glue, he says the thing that has had the stickiness to our society in terms of any advance that's had any lasting impact in American society has been the result of close cross-cultural collaboration. Close cross-cultural collaboration. Nothing has happened without it. Nothing permanent has happened. Think about it. Think about the leaders we've had, the black leaders we've had. They had close cultural, cross-cultural collaboration. Dr. King, Cesar Chavez, close, I mean, so this, I'm so happy that we're doing this. Lastly, the campus conversations on race down to the neighborhoods where they started from could be a way of us getting this out to the nation, because this is wonderful, but we can't repeat this in 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 cities. But the neighborhood conversations, not the town-wide meetings, because it brings the choir, the neighborhood ones where you actually go to your neighbor that you don't know what they're thinking, is a model you might want to look at. And I'm just saying that now because I've got to leave tonight, but thank you again for being a part of this.
Amanda Sage, then Jay Lavender, then Mary Farrell. Amanda, by the way, came to us from having seen the op-ed on CNN and written in, and we're delighted you're here.
My background is I've spent the last 2.5 years living in Ghana, and if any white person wants to learn what it's like to be a minority, be a pale-skinned white girl in a very dark-skinned African country and be one of 10 in an entire city. You'll learn real quick what it feels like to be a minority. Ghanaians are like I said, they're my specialty, but I've studied Africa a lot. And they have their tradition, but they look to the West now for new culture. And they don't get more than an hour of CNN a day, and it's piped in at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 2 TV stations that make it across the entire country. So they don't see that. They don't see much positive. What they get is they get movies, music, and now music videos. And they focus on rap and hip-hop. I have nothing against those. I listen to some of it. I don't listen to the negative. They're listening to the negative, and thank God they don't understand some of it because they don't understand the slang. because their culture would be aghast at what it says. But what's sad is they do understand part of it, and they emulate it. They go around saying the N-word. I have never uttered that word in my life, and I have smacked people for saying it in Ghana because they don't know where it comes from. They don't learn American history. What we have to realize is the negative media attention that is happening in America is not only being shown in America, it is being shown across the world. We have a bad enough image as it is. And maybe Europe and part of Asia, they get their own news sources. There is no international, or there's no national news source for Africa. They get it from popular culture. I had a friend, and we were joking once, and I said, would she ever marry an American? And she said, no, they all own guns. This is what we have to change the focus of, is not only is the wrong image being shown by the media, it's being supported by the people themselves too often. It's the wrong thing, and it's not a reality that is spread across this country. It's such a minute percentage, and it's the wrong thing. It needs to be the positive image that is purported in the media and in music and in movies, like you've been saying, so the rest of the world can realize not only what America needs to realize, but the rest of the world needs to realize is there's a lot better there than there's worse.
Thank you. Jay Lavender.
Can you hear me all right? What's exciting about where we are right now in terms of this great transformation that's going on in media is that right now, although we're all watching media, media is watching us. You talk about the cultural conditioning, Joe. And what's so great right now is if you think in the last 5 years, through the top new websites, Facebook, MySpace, YouTube, those didn't exist 5 years ago. And those have all shot to the top because we're watching each other. So we've got tools that we never had before in history for us to communicate with each other and push our stories out. You look at Batman, made a lot of records last weekend because of what they like to call pre-awareness in Hollywood right now. It existed. It was pre-existing material. We have the ability to do that exact same thing now with all these stories we've heard here today. So what I'd encourage you guys to do is think of two things. For those of you that have shared the past, and I've learned an incredible amount here today, it's inspiring to listen to all of you, tell your stories. But let's also think about D'Angelo and Marlon who sat here, and let's honor the present. Because for all the anger and frustration that exists and is never going to truly, completely go away, there's so much hope in that future. When I listen to what Marlon said today and how eloquent, articulate he was, and how poised, you realize in his life, half of his life, the towers have been gone. The war over Iraq has been about a third of his life. Katrina was more than just a name in his life. You think of, if you look through the world through his eyes, there's so much hope because he sat there so poised and articulate and there wasn't as much anger, there wasn't as much frustration. So if you guys will take the time to tell the stories you shared here today, and you'll take the time to reach out to somebody who's his age and help them tell their story today as well, I'd be honored to help you push those out. If I can't do it myself in LA, I'll put you in touch with someone who can. And as Mr. Goss will attest, we have tools we never had before to share these. And if the audience shows up for your stories, then guess what? Big media will follow because they're watching us.
Mary Farrell.
Thank you. I want to follow up on both Marjorie and Bruce's comments because I do think the media has enormous power in the United States, unfortunately, to reinforce stereotypes and be part of that cultural conditioning that you referred to. You have, in some ways, the more egregious things are not the worst. I was thinking of the awful remarks about the UConn women's basketball team that were so offensive that the nation kind of rose up in shock. But more damaging are the insidious ongoing stereotypes, I think, of blacks and minorities on television because it has a very negative impact over time, both for white children who may live in unintegrated areas, and that's what they see, and for black children for whom it's, again, an ongoing exposure. But so I want to switch that and say that one of the things I hope we can do coming out of here, Mr. Wenger said we need to have an army going forth, and maybe one battle should be the media, because I think there are positive things. I'm going to just mention three. I remember many years ago, 60 Minutes did a segment where Diane Sawyer was the host, and she sent a young black man and a young white man out to get an apartment, to go shopping, a few things, and I was shocked. I obviously have not had the black experience growing up. I would not have believed how bad it was until I saw on camera how differently these two young men who were matched for background were treated. Second thing is, I have no idea how long this ad was. I think one of the most powerful things I've seen on television was the ad that began, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste, give to the United Negro College Fund." That had an enormous impact on me, and I know from talking to others too. I happen to be involved in scholarships at a certain school. And the third thing I'd mention is I was on a public television program for 22 years called Wall Street Week with Louis Rukeyser. There were 22 panelists, and way before diversity was a buzzword on Wall Street, much less a legal imperative, Lou had 3 black men and 5 women as his 22 panelists. I actually had a black man who works on Wall Street now tell me that he was in his teens flipping through the dial, wondered what this program was with this well-dressed black man talking and saying it was the first time he realized a black could actually work on Wall Street. And I heard that over and over from a number of women and minorities who ended up on Wall Street because of that image, made them realize this was a possibility, that they weren't sure how they would get it, but they realized at least they could try for it. So I'd like to hope that going forward, and certainly this day is wasted if we've all had a wonderful conversation, and I personally have benefited enormously from it, but it has to continue. Not that I have any doubt Janet could do it on her own, but she can't clone herself enough. So I think we need to be that army. We need to pick the battles and proceed.
Our final speakers will be Cliff Alexander, LaToya Foster, Murray Horowitz, Tom Allen, and Deepak, you get the last word.
Thank you. I'd like to make a historical correction for the Washington Post. I represented 6 black reporters 34 years ago. And, pardon me, 7 black reporters. We filed charges against the Post because they didn't have anybody following as national reporters covering sub-Saharan Africa or working on anything other than Metro. Only because they pushed the door, like we have to get out of this room, was there a change at the Washington Post. Before we all sing Kumbaya, let us remember that when Barack Obama becomes president on January 20th, I will not get 40 acres and a mule. We all in this room, particularly white people in the media, and by the way, reporters today are less than 3% black. There are over a majority of newspapers in this country that have no black reporters. So while we're patting ourselves on the back for being inclusive and loving black people and wanting to do the best we can, let us remember we have a fight ahead of us, and you see it every day, and it's important to do it and be optimistic and loving at the same time.
LaToya.
Good afternoon. First and foremost, I have to thank Secretary Cohen and Mrs. Cohen, who I absolutely admire and love and look to them and regard them as family. And I appreciate everything that they're doing as they fearlessly address the issue of racism in this country. And Mr. Madison, as a mentor, you've certainly left a lot on the minds of the people here today, which relates to just the points that I want to make. As a member of the media, I feel a tremendous amount of responsibility to all of those who open up their homes to us, who allow us to ride with them in radio, in their cars, as they're going to work and from work. They trust us and depend on us to report accurate information. But we also walk a fine line because we influence their perspectives and their views. But one of the greatest challenges that we face is that there's not enough African-American representation in key decision-making roles. You know, right now as we're speaking today at 4:54 p.m. in Chicago, Illinois right now, the National Association of Black Journalists are convening to examine the opportunities for African Americans in front of the camera, behind the camera, and in the executive offices. And, you know, even though right now we're watching Barack Obama possibly becoming the first black president of the United States and the leader of the free world. You know, we're seeing more African-American representation in mainstream media, but it's still not enough. And as Mr. Madison stated, that we don't have any African-Americans leading these conversations on any of the major networks. And that's another thing about Barack Obama's candidacy. Is so much larger than just him becoming president of the United States and the leader of the free world. It also, we have to pay attention to the opportunities that it opens up for more African-American and minority representation in the media, for more minorities to run for statewide offices in predominantly white states. We saw in Iowa the silent movement that took place in the state with the 5th largest white American population that overwhelmingly supported an African-American for president. So his candidacy is so much more, and he's discussed that when he is inaugurated president of the United States, that this country will look at itself differently and the world will look at itself differently. And we discussed that in our interview, not so much the symbolic reasons behind his presidency if he's elected, but what it represents as his theme of change. So his candidacy goes well beyond what we're talking about as far as him becoming president of the United States. But going back to how it pertains to the media, we need more African-American and minority representation in those executive offices, and that's the role that we have to play. We have to apply pressure to these networks and the sponsors the same way we did when Don Imus, when he made those racially insensitive remarks about the Rutgers University women's basketball team. We picketed, we made a big fuss about it, and we got him removed. And that's the same way we have to make sure that we have more minority representation in those executive offices, and so that we are strategically positioned in roles that we can create a difference, so that we can see those untold stories on the air, such as the young man who was with us earlier, those African-American and minority candidates who we do not see enough of. There's so many stories that go untold. 500,000 children in the foster care system, 2/3 of those being minorities, young minorities who have become missing and kidnapped. We don't hear those stories the same as we heard about John Benet Ramsey. So there's a lot more that has to be done in the media. So we have a role that we have to play when we leave out of here today, to not drop the ball, but to make sure that we're placing a lot more pressure on our networks to position minorities in key decision-making roles, so that our young people in generations to come can embrace Barack Obama's theme of change, and they can say not only yes we can, but yes we will. Thank you.
Murray?
Thank you. I guess it's appropriate in a session on media to make a Hollywood reference and to say to Bill and Janet that if it's not evident to you by now, you need to be told that we are all in this room coneheads. So thank you so much for that, and my apologies to the crowd. I'm always struck by this. This is not particularly apropos of anything, except we are in the National Press Building, and I always remember that when I'm in this building, that in this building for some years, Zora Neale Hurston worked as a manicurist. I'm glad that some of my colleagues here have mentioned the commercial aspect of what we do. I work now at the American Film Institute. Much has been said of documentary. My colleague Patricia Finneran, who runs the Silver Docs Documentary Festival, is here. And I'm not here, I wouldn't defend Hollywood, but when we talk about images in film and images on television programs, I think we ignore a very, very important aspect of media and cultural conditioning, Joe, in America, and that's commercials. The average American child between the ages of 2 and 6 sees 20,000 commercial messages a year on television. This is not to impugn boards of directors and CEOs who have to sell things. They have to answer to their shareholders. But it is the duty of the commercial to sell things to people. And those people have to make the most. They sell things by making the most of the status quo. And therefore, commercials very often, most often I would argue, reinforce the status quo. We are all in this room here about shaking up the status quo and making change. Beyond reinforcing the status quo, however, commercials do a lot to present people with a vision of what they should want their lives to be like and how their lives could be so much better if only they had this or that product or service. Commercials, in a way, offer us dreams to which we're to subscribe. When Marlon Marshall talks eloquently about making his dreams come true, for so many American young people, those dreams come from marketers. And it's very difficult for them to sort out their own dreams and their valid dreams from the ones that mean to sell them something or other. In general, I would argue the experience of African Americans in this country that, as we've been shown today, is an experience of almost endless being put upon, to put it very mildly, of endless wrongs and violent wrongs. It also features a response on the part of African Americans, I would argue, in general, of unfailing grace and class and humor and achievement. But I would argue that on commercials, I ask how well that picture is being put across. How much of that do we see? What kind of proper dreams do we give our children through commercials? And I think that there ought to be a way to accommodate Dr. King's dream in the dreams that want to sell us things as well. Marketing, to quote Hodding Carter many years ago, is the biggest force abroad in the world today. And we really can't see much to combat it. Yet marketing divides people into ever narrower demographic segments. And I get to see things because they're marketed to me, American white males of a certain age. Other people are marketed other things. And these slivers of demographics we could also call segregation. And it seems to me that marketing is maybe the most powerful force in dividing Americans today, and we have to think about how to combat it. Thanks so much, and thanks again to you.
Tom, and then Deepak.
Okay, thank you. If there was one thing I wanted to get across today, it's the concept that, that underneath history is a hidden history. I met an Irish historian one time who said every country has a grand story. And the grand story exists by throwing out the stuff that doesn't work in the grand story. So you go beneath the grand story and you find some other stories. And this discovery I made when Paul Dixon and I were working on a book called The Bonus Army. In 1932, about 20,000 veterans came to Washington in what was then the biggest demonstration in the history of the United States. It got covered kind of daintily by the media. And Paul and I, going through newspaper records, found a lot about the daily lives of the veterans, many of whom were in Anacostia across the river. Anacostia was then a black and white neighborhood. The black and white neighborhoods were basically side by side, and sometimes there would be one grocery store selling both of them. The veterans, the story we thought was a story underneath the grand story. And then we found there were two other stories even beneath those. And it's become my belief as a writer that almost every hidden story beneath history in the United States has a black element or a black story that is amazing to people. I'll leave you the Revolution, the Civil War, the War of 1812, the Korean War, Vietnam War. But let me just tell you about the Bonus Army for a minute. The Bonus Army was covered by the daily newspapers in Washington, by the New York Times, by the Baltimore Sun. It was almost a daily story in those papers. There is hardly any mention of the Negroes who were among the bonus marchers. The only mention would be if once in a while there would be some trouble. And that if there was trouble and there were 5 guys arrested for anything, one of them or 2 of them would be named as Negroes. You don't need to name the white guys as white. And then one day we discovered that the veterans, in order to make some money, had hired had commissioned a photographer to go around and take pictures of the encampment, particularly the one in Anacostia. And by chance, we got a bunch of those postcards. Actually, got it off eBay. Somebody who collected them thought they were collecting covered bridges or something, and they wound up with these things, so we got them real cheap. And when you looked at the postcards, my God, the bonus army was integrated. This was at a time when Washington was a segregated city. But those guys were, even the Mississippi delegation was integrated. And what integrated them was poverty and a common cause. But the media didn't want to go near that, and they wouldn't have gone near it today probably. And we looked at this and tried to find some coverage somewhere when we saw the phenomenon. There were guys standing in line waiting to get a haircut, and there were guys standing in line waiting to get books from the Salvation Army tent where they had set up a library. And it's black and white, black and white. And we finally got one reference that was in the crisis. The NAACP had sent a young reporter named Roy Wilkins to look at what the heck was going on. And he wrote a story, and he said that Jim Crow does not exist inside the bonus army. It exists in Washington, D.C. These guys couldn't go out, a white guy and black guy walking out of the Anacostia camp couldn't go to the same movie house. They couldn't go to the same restaurant. They couldn't get on the same bus. But they could sleep, and Roy Wilkins has an image in his report where he said, I looked and saw black feet and white feet sticking out of the same pup tent. And I just give you this today because I think that there was a lesson there, or maybe 2. First of all, the media didn't cover the real story. And secondly, if you can get a bunch of people together who are after the same thing and are lacking the same thing and deprived of the same thing, in this case a bonus, that for their service in World War I, which they had been promised, then I think you can get black and white together pretty easily. And when we went one step deeper, we didn't find any reference to this anywhere but in a black newspaper. By the way, all of the papers I mentioned were on microfilm, and as we worked on the book, found out that they were digitized. Not black newspapers. You've got to go find black newspapers and look them up in obscure libraries. One black newspaper analyzes why these guys were not getting the bonus. They didn't get the bonus till 1936. After presidential vetoes by both Herbert Hoover and Franklin D. Roosevelt. And the black paper explains it very neatly. There was a double-tier wage system in the American South. And if you could keep the black wages below the white wages, then the white guys didn't mind it as much. But the bonus that was to be given to the veterans of World War I, the same amount of money was to have gone to black veterans as to white veterans. And that's why this one was locked up from 1930, well, actually from 1922 to 1936. It was a basis of economic power in the hands of Southern members of Congress who said, we don't want to give blacks that much money. And by coincidence, when FDR is running for re-election in 1936, after having vetoed the bonus 3 times to satisfy his Southern constituencies, they're the constituencies of the Southern congressmen, he realized he was running for president. He passed the word, if you overcome my veto, it will be okay by me. It was the first veto of FDR that was ever overcome, first and only, as far as I know.
Tom,
And they got
I
their-
apologize. but
$4
we're-
billion went into the economy.
By the book.
The final word to Deepak Chopra.
I really appreciated Mr. Madison's remarks on cultural conditioning, because cultural conditioning is a set of assumptions we make as a whole culture. And I just wanted to say that I remember 2 sound bites that helped me change my conditioning. The first was when I was in high school, and the Soviet astronauts had just gone into space, and one of them had come to our school. This is in India. I went to a Jesuit missionary school, and I asked one of the astronauts, had they seen God in space? And he said, yes, she's black. You know, until then I had assumed that God was a dead white male in the sky, thanks to my Irish Christian brother's education. The second was in the 1970s, when I just come to the United States, and I was watching Sanford and Son, and they'd had a burglary in their house, and there were these 3 white cops doing an investigation. So they were asking, you know, what was stolen, what had been robbed, you know, were there any violence, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, very hesitantly, the cop asks Sanford, he says, was this burglar colored? And without hesitation, Sanford said, yes, white.
With that, we're going to bring this session to a close. We are going to invite you all to come out to the reception. I'm going to turn the mic over to Bill Cohen and Janet Cohen to introduce the final part of today. And I guess the only question that I have is for you, William Smith, and I don't know if he's still here. When you said it's impossible for us to replicate this conversation in 3,000 communities around the country, I guess I would ask the same question that we asked when we did this conference, which is, why not?
We're going to break so that the team can come in and take the tables out, so that a portion of Janet's play is going to be performed here on this stage. And so there'll be refreshments served in the next room while the tables are being broken down. And we won't tax your patience too much longer. The play, which normally would run, just the reading of it, about 45 minutes, I think will be confined to about 15. But the play is important. When people ask, what do you do from this point forward, and Janet said West Virginia, Florida, Mississippi, this play hopefully will go into the school system for the ages of children 13, 14, and 15, so that we can talk about the issue of hate and how hate kills, how it killed a brilliant young woman named Anne Frank, and how it killed a young black boy from Chicago in Money, Mississippi, and to see the parallels between the oppressor and the oppressed in Europe and over here in the United States, between what the Nazis did to the Jews and what the Klan and the racists have done to black people in this country is really quite extraordinary. But we'll see that in a few moments, and let me just conclude and thank. I won't conclude. Janet will conclude.
I just want to thank you all very much for coming, and your patience and your content and the things that you've shared, and to do the action, do the work beyond this room. In the meantime, refreshments and cocktails are outside, and I want you to come back, if you can, to see the young actors do an abbreviated form of my play, Anne and Emmett, based on the tragic lives of Anne Frank and Emmett Till. Thank you very much.
Take your materials with you. We're in a different room tomorrow. Take your materials with you. We're in a different room tomorrow.